My name is Harold Whitman. I'm 82 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've lived in a faded yellow house on the outskirts of Grove Hill, Ohio, where the cornfields stretch farther than the eye can see, and the winters seem to last longer than they used to. My house stands quiet at the end of a gravel road flanked by an aging oak tree that lost its top in last year's storm and a creaky wooden fence that I never got around to fixing after my stroke. People say the house looks tired, like it's dozing off. Maybe it is, maybe I am too. There's not much left to keep it awake. I used to be a high school biology teacher, taught for 42 years at Grover Cleveland High, same room, same chalkboard, same window view of the flagpole. The kids used to call me Doc Whit. Not because I had a doctorate, I didn't, but because I knew every tree, every insect, every feathered creature in the state, and could mimic a morning dove's call so well that they'd turn their heads to the window. Every time I did it, I loved teaching. Not the grading, not the staff meetings, but the classroom, being there, making the kids see something they hadn't noticed before, helping them look closer at the world. That was my rhythm. Then I retired. No fanfare. Just a plaque with my name on it and a thank you card from the principal that probably his secretary wrote. The next Monday morning, I woke up and didn't know what to do with myself. I remember thinking, so this is it. My wife Eleanor passed away 6 years ago, right after Christmas. A stroke took her. Quick, merciful, they said. I held her hand in the hospital room as the monitors flatlined. That sound stayed with me longer than her voice. After she died, our son Daryl came around more often, but it never felt right. He'd show up with that distant look in his eyes, sit in my living room, scrolling through his phone, talk to me like I was a patient rather than a father. He brought my prescriptions, mowed the lawn sometimes, always in a rush. I thought it was grief. I told myself he was adjusting, that time would soften him, but it didn't. He changed after Eleanor died, got colder, sharper, more impatient. I started to feel like I was in his way. Daryl was our only child. Eleanor wanted more, but it just didn't happen. He was a shy boy, always building things alone in his room, talking more to his Lego castles than to other kids. I remember driving him to Cub Scouts and waiting in the parking lot because he cried when I tried to leave. I did everything for that boy. Maybe that was the mistake. Maybe I protected him too much, praised him too quickly, spared him the weight of his own failures. He grew up smart, became a financial planner in Columbus, married a woman named Clarissa who never liked me much, thought I was too old-fashioned, whatever that means. They had no kids. Too much hassle, Daryl once said, as if raising him hadn't been the hardest, best, most soul-wrenching gift of my life. After my stroke last year, I lost a bit of myself. Not all at once. Bits and pieces like ash blowing off a fire. Words took longer to come. My right hand trembled when I reached for a glass. The mornings became a ritual of tests. Can I stand? Can I button this shirt? Can I remember why I came into the kitchen? I was in rehab for 6 weeks, then sent home. Alone. A nurse came twice a week, cheerful and overworked, always in a hurry. The rest of the time, it was just me, the television, and the birds outside the window. Daryl visited twice in 3 months. Each time he brought groceries and a clipboard with insurance forms, he always asked the same question, soft and casual, like it didn't matter. "Have you thought about your estate plan, Dad?" I told him not yet. Truth was, I hadn't thought about anything beyond the next sunrise. My days were too small for that. But the question stayed. It clung to me like mildew. When I finally told him I wasn't ready to talk about wills or property, he didn't argue. He just nodded and looked past me, like he was already imagining a future where I wasn't in the room. The loneliness thickened in the house. Time moved in strange ways. Sometimes I'd fall asleep at noon and wake up thinking it was morning. The mail became my only excitement. I'd walk to the box in my robe and slippers like a ritual pilgrimage. Most days, there was nothing but catalogs and silence. The neighbors, if you can call them that, don't come by. One family moved out last spring, the other keeps to themselves. I haven't had a real conversation in weeks. When the second stroke came, it was worse. I remember falling near the kitchen sink, cold tiles, the edge of the counter slamming into my ribs, then darkness. Next thing I knew, I was in a hospital bed, tethered to wires, my mouth dry, my mind fogged. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I saw Daryl once, maybe it was twice, standing at the foot of the bed, talking to the doctor. I tried to call out, but nothing came. He looked at me like he was looking at an empty box. That was the worst of it. Not the pain, not the fear, but that look, like I was already gone. I didn't know how long I was out. Days, maybe weeks. When I came to again, really came back, the nurse told me something strange. She said, "We didn't expect you to wake up, Mr. Whitman. Your son made all the arrangements. Cremation, small memorial at your house. It was all very fast." I blinked at her, trying to understand. She showed me the paperwork. There it was. My name, my birth date, and a signature that wasn't mine authorizing cremation as per verbal directive. My hands shook. My heart pounded. I wasn't dead. Not yet. But my son had already buried me. I asked the nurse where he was. She said he'd gone back to Columbus, said he'd signed all the discharge papers, and thanked the hospital for taking good care of his late father. That phrase, late father, kept echoing in my skull. I stared at the ceiling of that hospital room and felt something inside me go quiet. A click, like the final turn of a key, and I realized right then and there that my son didn't want me alive. Not anymore. The moment I realized I'd been scheduled for cremation by my own son was not marked by rage or even heartbreak, but by a long, hollow silence inside my chest, as if my heart had briefly stopped to let the truth settle in. I lay there in the hospital bed, the sterile light above flickering ever so slightly, and stared at the beige ceiling tiles as the nurse quietly left the room. I was no longer a patient recovering from a stroke. I was, in official records and in the minds of my only remaining family, a corpse awaiting disposal. My own flesh and blood had declared me dead, signed my dignity away in cheap blue ink, and returned home to plan a tidy, cost-effective farewell. My body, had things gone according to their plan, would have been reduced to ashes in a rented oven with a name tag taped to a tin container. I would have disappeared without so much as a wake or a folded flag. And what's worse, no one would have known it was a lie. There was a clipboard resting on the counter in the corner, probably left by a nurse during rounds. I forced my body upright, trembling under its own weight, and took 2 faltering steps toward it. My hospital gown felt loose on my frame, my legs fragile like matchsticks under a paper bridge, but I reached the counter and held on. The clipboard had discharge notes, schedules, vital signs, and then, stapled at the back, a document titled Authorization of Cremation. There it was again, my full name, Social Security number, birth date, and a scrawl of a signature that claimed to be mine. But it wasn't. I've signed enough report cards and field trip forms to know my own name. This was Daryl's doing. And beneath that, the line that made my stomach turn. No memorial service requested. Immediate cremation preferred. I put the clipboard down slowly, my fingers trembling as if they didn't trust the world anymore. I shuffled back to the bed and sat down hard, out of breath. There was a soft knock on the door. A young man in scrubs poked his head in. He was new, a resident maybe, with dark circles under his eyes and a kindness in his voice that made me want to cry. "Mr. Whitman," he said carefully, "you're awake. That's something of a surprise." I nodded slowly. "You and me both." He stepped in and shut the door gently behind him. "I'm Dr. Shaw. I was the one overseeing your chart for the last couple of days." He looked nervous, maybe unsure how to explain the strange dance between death and resurrection I'd just performed. "Your son said you had no advance directives on file, no living will, but he assured us that cremation was in accordance with your wishes." I held up my hand. "That's not true," I said, and my voice was raspy, foreign to my own ears. "I never agreed to that. I never signed anything." Dr. Shaw looked genuinely startled. Then there's been a serious mistake." I told him everything I could, about the first stroke, about Daryl's visits, about the way he'd been nudging me towards signing documents I hadn't fully read, and how I always deflected those conversations. Dr. Shaw listened carefully, nodding, the muscles around his jaw tightening as I spoke. When I finished, he sighed and sat in the chair beside the bed. "Mr. Whitman, I think you should speak to someone from the hospital board. This is serious. If you hadn't woken up when you did, well, frankly, they were arranging the transport of your body. The order had already gone out to the crematorium." I stared at the floor. "Did they notify anyone else? Friends? Neighbors?" He shook his head. "Just your son. We asked him if there was anyone else, but he said you had no one." That landed like a stone in my gut. No one. That word, spoken so casually by the man I raised, cut deeper than any betrayal. It meant I was disposable. Not even worth a phone call to the folks at the VFW Hall. Not worth an obituary in the local paper. Just gone. I asked if I could be discharged. Dr. Shaw looked uncomfortable. "It's irregular considering your condition. But you're lucid, mobile, and stable. If you insist, we can prepare your papers by tomorrow. I can personally help make arrangements to get you home or somewhere safe." I nodded. "I don't want to go home." He raised an eyebrow. Then where? I thought about that. I hadn't a clue. I didn't know where Daryl was living now. He'd sold their old house last year. I didn't have a car anymore. My phone had been missing since the stroke, but I had a bank card in my wallet and a mind that was still, by some miracle, mine. That was a start. That night, I stayed awake in the hospital bed, eyes fixed on the half-drawn curtain and the faint blue glow of a monitor. I listened to the breathing of the man in the next room, the gentle beep of machines keeping people like me alive, or pretending to. I thought of Eleanor, of her quiet warmth, her hand on mine, as we watched storms roll in across the cornfields. I whispered to her, not really expecting an answer. They tried to burn me, Ellie, while I was still here. By morning, I was ready. Dr. Shaw kept his word and arranged for me to be discharged. I refused the hospital transport and instead asked if he knew someone who could drive me, quietly. A nurse named Marla, in her early 50s and clearly disillusioned by the institution, offered to take me in her old sedan during her lunch break. "Where to?" she asked as we climbed in. I gave her Daryl's last known address. It was a long shot, but I had to start somewhere. The drive was long, through winding rural roads that I hadn't seen since Eleanor's funeral. The sky was overcast, the trees casting long shadows over the pavement, and Marla filled the silence with soft hums to the radio. We pulled into a suburban neighborhood on the far side of Columbus, where all the houses looked like they were printed off the same factory line. "You sure about this?" she asked. I nodded. "I'll figure it out from here." She handed me a brown paper bag with a sandwich and a bottle of water. "Just in case," she said, then drove off without asking for anything in return. I walked slowly toward the address, my knees stiff and my chest heavy. The house was freshly painted, a tasteful gray with white trim. Cars lined the curb. Balloons and a banner hung over the front door. My eyes narrowed. I recognized the shape of my own name on the sign. Black letters on white fabric. My heart dropped. The banner read, "In loving memory of Harold Whitman." There were folding chairs set up on the lawn, tables with catering trays. Laughter spilled from the open windows. People were gathered in clusters, drinks in hand, dressed in casual morning black. I stood still, staring. A woman passed me on the sidewalk and did a double take. Her eyes widened. Her hand went to her mouth. And in that moment, as she staggered back and gasped, I understood exactly what I had walked into. My son had thrown me a funeral, and I wasn't even dead. I stood there on the sidewalk, a ghost among the living, watching people raise glasses to my absence. There was a photograph of me propped up on an easel near the garage door, a picture from a decade ago taken at a 4th of July barbecue, where I was wearing a Hawaiian shirt and holding a pair of tongs, grinning like an idiot over a plate of burnt sausages. A black ribbon had been digitally added to the corner of the photo, and beneath it, in bold serif type, it read, "In loving memory, Harold Whitman, 1943 to 2025. I felt the breath hitch in my throat. They had chosen that picture to represent my life. That laugh, that cheap shirt. That was what they wanted to remember, and here I was, standing just a few feet away, alive, blinking, and unwelcome. No one noticed me at first. I was just another old man in a world that doesn't stop to examine old men. I shuffled toward the edge of the lawn, hands shaking from the cold and from something deeper, rage maybe, or disbelief that was so wide it had nowhere to settle. A couple near the door turned and froze. The man squinted, and the woman's plastic wine cup trembled in her hand. "Is that?" she whispered, clutching the man's arm. I stepped onto the grass. The moment my shoe left the sidewalk, a ripple passed through the crowd like a dropped stone in still water. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned, forks paused in the air. I heard the clink of a glass tipping over and the muffled thump as it hit the lawn. Then Darrell appeared in the doorway holding a tray of deviled eggs, chatting with a heavy-set man in a checkered blazer. He was laughing, genuinely, carelessly, his face flushed with a particular kind of self-satisfaction that only comes when the people around you believe the story you're telling. He caught sight of me mid-laugh, and his mouth stopped moving. The tray tilted slightly. One egg rolled and fell, then another. I watched it happen in silence, watched his whole body stiffen and his face drain of color until he looked like a statue left out in winter. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, two men standing in the wake of a lie so large it had its own gravity. "Dad," he finally said, but it came out like a question, like he was still hoping it was an impersonator or a dream or maybe even a shared hallucination. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The murmuring started up behind him. Guests moved away from the tables, some of them whispering, others gaping openly. A child, probably the son of one of Darrell's work friends, pointed and said, "Mommy, that's the man from the picture." And the mother yanked his hand sharply, pulling him behind her like I was a rabid animal escaped from its enclosure. I kept walking past the folding chairs, past the carefully arranged bouquet of lilies on the porch, and stopped a few feet in front of my son. "Having a nice party?" I asked, my voice low, cracked, but clear. Darrell was silent. His mouth opened and closed once, like a goldfish struggling for air. "Would you like to explain," I continued, "to your friends, to your colleagues, to your neighbors, why the man you cremated just walked up your driveway?" A few people laughed nervously. Others looked genuinely afraid. Darrell stepped forward, hands raised slightly, as though approaching a wild animal. "Dad, listen. I can explain." "No," I cut him off. "No, I don't think you can." I turned and looked at the guests. "Everyone, thank you for coming, but I'm afraid this event has been scheduled a little prematurely." That broke the spell. Someone let out a loud bark of laughter. Another person clapped, perhaps not understanding the situation entirely. People began murmuring, some edging toward the sidewalk, others pulling out their phones. I caught the eye of a woman in a black pantsuit, who I recognized vaguely. She'd worked at the hospital front desk once, I think. She looked pale. "Is this real?" she asked. "He's supposed to be dead." "Yes," I said. "I was supposed to be. My son made sure of that. Scheduled the cremation, declined a funeral, told the hospital I didn't want any guests or ceremony. Just ashes and silence." I turned to Darrell again. "Tell them, Darrell. Tell them what you told the nurse, that I didn't want anyone informed, that I had no friends, that I wanted to disappear quietly. Daryl was sweating now. The tray of eggs hung limp in his hands. You had a stroke, he stammered. They said you might not wake up. You were already what? I said, stepping closer. Already dead? Already inconvenient? Already forgotten? His eyes darted toward the crowd, toward Clarissa, who had just emerged from the house, her mouth open in a horrified "oh" as she stared at me. It was a mistake, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Was the fake signature a mistake too? I asked. The authorization form? The rushed cremation order? Was it all just a clerical error? Daryl said nothing. Clarissa stepped forward then, her voice shrill. You scared us, Harold. You were unresponsive for days. The doctor said there was no chance. We didn't know what to do. So, you decided to pretend I was dead and plan a barbecue? I asked, gesturing toward the buffet table. Complete with sangria and shrimp skewers, she flushed. It was a celebration of life, she muttered. I barked a laugh. Whose life? Mine. You barely tolerated me when I was alive. The air had turned heavy. A few guests had begun to leave, quietly sliding into their cars, unsure whether to offer condolences or apologies. Others lingered, watching as if afraid to miss what would happen next. I want to see the papers, I said finally, the ones you signed, the ones that declared me legally dead. Daryl glanced back at the house. They're inside, he said faintly. I nodded. Then let's go look at them together. You and me. And if the ink on those signatures doesn't match mine, we'll call the police. How does that sound? He didn't move. His hand twitched slightly, and he looked around again, as if waiting for someone to step in, to stop this train before it hit the station. But no one moved. No one spoke. The weight of the lie had settled on him like cement, and it was dragging him down. You were never supposed to see this, he said, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. But I heard it. I heard every word. The inside of Daryl's house was everything I expected, and nothing I recognized. It smelled like fresh paint and lemon polish, like a place recently staged for guests, not lived in. The walls were beige, the furniture all matching in that lifeless catalog way, as if someone had walked into a showroom and said, I'll take the whole page. No trace of warmth, no pictures of our family, no mementos from childhood. It was sterile and curated, a house meant for impression, not comfort. I followed him through the front hall in silence, Clarissa trailing behind, like a shadow that didn't want to be seen. The laughter and music from outside had gone quiet. Through the windows, I saw people pretending not to look in, whispering behind wine glasses. Daryl led me to a small home office near the back, its shelves lined with financial planning books and a diploma from Ohio State. There was a filing cabinet in the corner, locked, of course. He knelt down, pulled a key from his pocket, and opened the top drawer. From inside, he took out a manila envelope with my name on it in large, shaky letters. This is everything, he said, without turning around. Medical records, hospital correspondence. The authorization form, I took the envelope from him, my hand still unsteady but firm. I walked to the desk and opened it slowly, like diffusing a bomb. Inside were exactly what he said: papers from the hospital, a copy of my ID, a formal letter expressing condolences from the facility administrator, and finally, the document that mattered most. I unfolded it with the care of someone holding a death certificate with their name on it. There it was again, my name, my date of birth, the checkbox next to cremation requested per verbal directive, and beneath it, a scrawled signature. It was a near-perfect imitation, but it wasn't mine. It had none of the tight curves I'd spent a lifetime perfecting, none of the slow, deliberate slope of my H. I had seen enough forged student excuses over the years to recognize the difference between real and real enough. I turned to Daryl and held it up. "This," I said, my voice sharp, "is a lie." He sat down heavily on the edge of the desk, his face pale and sunken. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said. "You were gone, Dad. You weren't waking up. The doctors said it was a matter of time." "That's not your decision to make," I snapped. "That's not your right. You didn't even wait. You didn't ask. You just signed my life away like I was a broken appliance." Clarissa hovered by the door, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "It wasn't just him," she said quietly. "We both agreed. We thought it was the kindest thing." I turned to her slowly. Kindness would have been sitting by my bed. Kindness would have been waiting. Kindness wouldn't have involved a forged signature and a goddamn backyard wake before the body was even cold. She flinched. Daryl looked down at the floor. "We were in debt," he admitted. "The hospital bills, your prescriptions, the mortgage. There was no money left. We thought if we handled it quickly, we could keep it from becoming a financial disaster. So you canceled my funeral," I said, astonished by how calmly the words came out. "You canceled my funeral to save money." Neither of them answered. There was nothing to say. I sat down in the chair opposite him, letting the papers rest on my lap. For a while no one spoke. A breeze rustled the sheer curtains behind us. Somewhere down the hall, a phone buzzed and went ignored. "How long were you going to wait?" I asked finally. "Before you touched my accounts, my house, my insurance?" Clarissa glanced at Daryl. He looked away. That was all the answer I needed. "I taught you better than this," I said, barely above a whisper. "Your mother did too. She'd be ashamed of you." Daryl's head snapped up. "Don't bring Mom into this," he hissed. "She's not here to argue." "Exactly," I said. "She's not here. But I am, and I'm not going anywhere." I stood up, pressing the papers back into the envelope. "You may have planned my death, Daryl, but you didn't plan for what happens when the dead walk back into their own lives." I left the house without another word. Outside, the crowd had mostly dispersed. The banner with my name still fluttered gently in the breeze. I paused at the curb, looked back once, and then walked down the street, not knowing where I was headed, only knowing I needed to keep moving. I wasn't dead, but something had ended that day, and I knew I would never step foot in that house again. I didn't go far that day. My legs, still weak from the hospital, carried me 3 blocks before the burn in my knees forced me to sit down at a bus stop, where the bench was warm from the afternoon sun and stained with the kind of neglect cities no longer bother to fix. I sat there for almost an hour, clutching the manila envelope like a wounded animal, watching the cars roll past and trying to assemble the pieces of what I had just walked through. The reality had not yet settled into something I could understand. There had been a photograph of me with black ribbons and guests with cocktails. There had been Daryl, pale and cornered, holding my death certificate. And then there was me, alive and no longer part of that house, no longer welcome in a place where my existence had become an inconvenience. When the sun began to dip and the heat started to fade from the bench, I stood again, slower this time, and walked to the corner gas station. I bought a bottle of water and asked the clerk if there was a motel nearby. He pointed down the road without much interest, and 10 minutes later, I was handing over what cash I had for a night in a dim, sagging room with yellow walls and a flickering lamp that hummed louder than the air conditioner. I sat on the edge of the bed, took off my shoes, and stared at the floor for a long time. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My mind replayed everything: Clarissa's guilt-laced silence, Daryl's weak defense, the way the crowd had stared like they were watching a man climb out of his own grave. At some point past midnight, I took out the envelope again and laid everything on the bed. I reread the hospital documents, the forged signature, the cremation order, the letter from the administrator. And something clicked. A kind of clarity that only comes after being stripped of every illusion. They hadn't just tried to cut me out. They'd prepared for it. They had expected I wouldn't wake up. And when I did, they didn't go to the hospital or call the doctors. They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't even pretend to care. They threw a party. They printed flyers. They stood in front of my photo and toasted their version of my life, because the real one had become too burdensome to bear. And when I stood on their lawn, breathing, blinking, still in possession of my name, they looked not relieved, not grateful, but terrified. Because the story they had rehearsed so carefully, the story where I was gone and everything I owned was now theirs, had unraveled in front of 30 witnesses. The next morning, I took a bus back to Grove Hill. It took 3 transfers and nearly 8 hours to get there. I paid with what little was left in my wallet and kept my head low the entire trip, afraid that if I caught someone's eye, they'd see something in me that didn't belong anymore. My house was still there, small and crooked as I had left it, though the weeds along the walkway had grown wild. The mailbox leaned drunkenly to one side, and a yellowed flyer from the electric company was wedged into the doorframe. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled like mildew and silence. I dropped my bag in the hallway and stood in the middle of the living room, not knowing what to do with myself. The house felt smaller now, more like a waiting room than a home. The armchair where I used to read was still facing the window, and Eleanor's old shawl hung on the back of the kitchen chair like it had been waiting for her to return. For a while, I just stood there, breathing in the stillness, listening to the creak of the boards beneath my feet, and wondering how long it would take for this place to feel mine again. It didn't take long for the next betrayal to arrive. 3 days after I returned home, I received a call from the bank. The woman on the line, polite but firm, said she needed to verify a transfer request, $12,000, from my savings account to a new joint account opened under Daryl's name. I told her I had made no such request. She paused, said she understood, and assured me the transaction would be blocked. I asked if someone had come into the branch. She said yes, that it had been Daryl, that he had presented medical documentation indicating I was no longer capable of managing my own finances. She said it was a common procedure for family members of at-risk seniors, and that the bank had been provided with what appeared to be legal documentation of my incapacity. My hand went cold around the receiver. I asked if she had a copy of the paperwork. She said yes, but that it was now under review due to my call. I told her to put a full freeze on the account until I could come in myself. She agreed. That afternoon, I walked to the bank. It took me nearly an hour with frequent stops along the way, but I made it. I sat across from a branch manager named Denise, who looked at me like I was a ghost. I showed her my ID, gave her the reference number, and told her I wanted to see everything Daryl had submitted. She hesitated, said it might not be permitted, then changed her mind after checking something on her computer. She left and returned with a thin folder. Inside were printed emails, a signed affidavit from Daryl claiming I was suffering from cognitive decline, and a faxed medical evaluation from a doctor I had never met, declaring me functionally nonverbal and disoriented. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. None of it was true. None of it had even happened. Daryl had made the appointment. Daryl had taken someone's signature. Daryl had declared me legally incompetent behind my back. "I want to speak to someone," I said, barely able to keep the rage from leaking into my voice. Denise nodded and handed me a business card. It belonged to a local elder law attorney. She said they handled situations like this more often than she liked to admit. That night, I called the number and scheduled an appointment. The lawyer's name was Randall Pierce. He was in his late 40s, with a face that looked like it had seen too many lies to be surprised by anything. I brought the folder, the envelope from the hospital, and my ID. He read through everything slowly, nodding now and then, making notes. When he was done, he looked up at me and said, "Mr. Whitman, this isn't just unethical, it's criminal." I asked him what my options were. He said we could pursue a fraud investigation, that we could file to revoke any powers of attorney that had been issued in my name, that we could freeze accounts, initiate probate review, request a formal capacity assessment. "But," he said, "if you really want to hit them where it hurts, we'll go after the house." I didn't understand at first. "The house?" I asked. "You mean their house?" He smiled grimly. "No, I mean your house. Your name is on the deed. You co-signed the mortgage. You paid the down payment. According to these documents, you're a legal 1/3 owner." I blinked at him. The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. I remembered signing some papers vaguely after Eleanor died. Daryl had said it was to help secure the loan, to make the bank feel more confident. I hadn't asked questions. I just wanted him to be stable, to have a future. Randall tapped the folder. "This gives us leverage. If you want to, you can force a sale." I stared at the desk for a long time, the weight of it all settling into my bones. "And if I do?" I asked. He shrugged. "Then Daryl and Clarissa lose the house, or they buy you out. Either way, they have to face you, and they have to pay." I nodded slowly. Let's do it. Over the next few weeks, Randall filed the necessary paperwork. He initiated a competency hearing, submitted affidavits from my doctors, arranged a neuropsychological evaluation, and prepared the motion to force the sale of the house. I passed every medical test. The hospital provided records that contradicted Daryl's claims. The doctor who had supposedly signed the incapacity form denied ever evaluating me. It was all falling apart. Daryl called once. I let it ring. Then came an email begging me to stop, saying it had been a misunderstanding, that they were just scared and trying to make the best decisions. I didn't reply. I let the process speak for me. And when the court date was set, I declined to appear. Randall would handle it. I had no more words left for that man. I had already buried a part of myself. I didn't need to do it again. The courthouse was a gray slab of stone and silence, tucked between a shuttered post office and a bakery that had long ago stopped baking anything fresh. I didn't attend the hearing. I couldn't. Not because I wasn't able to, but because I didn't trust myself to sit in that sterile room across from Daryl and Clarissa without saying something I'd regret. Randall went in my place. He carried a folder thick with evidence, copies of forged documents, testimony from hospital staff, results of my cognitive tests, and sworn statements from neighbors who'd seen me walk, talk, and manage my own household. He didn't need theatrics. The truth was heavy enough. I waited at home, drinking black coffee and watching the clock crawl from minute to minute, my breath catching every time the wind pressed against the windows, like a hand trying to come inside. When the call finally came, it wasn't Randall. It was Denise from the bank. She sounded calm, but beneath her voice was the tightness of someone who had just witnessed something unravel. "Mr. Whitman," she said, "the court ruled in your favor. The motion to declare you incapacitated has been dismissed, and the forced sale petition has been accepted. Your son and daughter-in-law have 30 days to either buy out your share or vacate the property." The judge was very clear. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat in the silence of my living room, the walls still humming with the ghosts of conversations past, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: justice. Not joy, not revenge, but something colder and more permanent, like a wound finally stitched shut. 2 days later, Clarissa showed up at my door, alone. Her car idled in the driveway like it was too ashamed to turn off its engine. She knocked softly, like she was afraid the house itself might reject her. I opened the door and stood there without a word. She looked thinner than I remembered, her face drawn, her hands clasped tightly in front of her like a student waiting for punishment. "Harold," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can we talk?" I stepped aside without speaking. She walked into the living room and looked around as if seeing it for the first time, even though she'd been here a dozen times back when Eleanor was alive. She didn't sit. I didn't offer. "We never meant to hurt you," she said. It got out of hand." I didn't respond. She turned to face me. "Daryl's ashamed. He hasn't slept in weeks. He thought you were gone. And when he realized you weren't, it was too late to undo everything. And he panicked. He didn't know how to fix it." I raised an eyebrow. "So he doubled down," faked a diagnosis, tried to clean up my account. Her lips tightened. We didn't use the money, she said quickly. It was never withdrawn. We thought if we got control of your estate, we could stabilize things. Stabilize, I repeated. That's a polite way of saying erase me from the picture. She looked down at her feet. We were drowning, Harold. You have no idea. Daryl lost 3 major clients. We were behind on the mortgage. Credit cards maxed. You thought I was worth more dead than alive, I said, finally sitting down. At least be honest. Clarissa walked to the window and stared out at the brittle lawn. What do you want from us? She asked quietly. What will make this end? I took a moment before answering. It won't end. It will change. But it won't go back. I'm selling my share. The court has ruled. You have 30 days. We don't have that kind of money, she said. Then you'll move, I replied, my voice calm and cold. You'll pack up your carefully staged life and start over, just like I had to. You wanted the future without me? You got it. She turned then, her face trembling. He's still your son. No, I said, meeting her eyes. He was. Now he's just a man who threw a funeral for someone still breathing. She said nothing else. She left quietly, the door clicking shut behind her. Like a final period at the end of a sentence that had been dragged out far too long. The next week, a real estate agent, one of Randall's contacts, came by the house. He was a polite man in his 50s, with sharp eyes and no small talk. He looked through the papers, confirmed my ownership, and began the process of listing my 1/3 share for sale. It's an unusual situation, he admitted. Most buyers won't want a partial share unless they intend to force a full sale. Let them, I said. Let the next knock on Daryl's door be from someone else. The listing went live. Within 10 days, 2 investors expressed interest. By the 3rd week, an offer was on the table, low but serious. The agent prepared the paperwork. I signed it without hesitation. The day I wired the funds into my account, I sat at my kitchen table, opened a new notebook, and wrote a single sentence at the top of the page. This chapter ends not in fire, but in withdrawal. I closed the notebook and poured myself a glass of water. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. I hadn't spoken to Daryl since the party. He hadn't called, hadn't written. That silence, once so cruel, now felt necessary. It was the only thing left between us that still resembled a kind of truth. But the day before the 30-day deadline expired, he appeared on my porch. No car, no Clarissa, just him, shoulders hunched, eyes rimmed with red. I opened the door and looked at him. Dad, he said, please, don't do this. I didn't speak. We'll lose everything, he continued. The house, our credit, our names. Please, I'll fix it. I'll sign whatever you want. Just don't finish this. You already finished it, I said. You finished it when you tried to bury me and bury the truth along with me. He stepped forward. I'm sorry, I swear to God. I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking. You were thinking plenty, I said. You were thinking about your mortgage, your debts, your future. You just weren't thinking about me. I didn't want it to be like this, he whispered. Neither did I replied. But we're here, And I'm not going back. He nodded slowly, like a man hearing his sentence read aloud. Then he turned and walked away, not looking back. I watched him go, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt liberated. The house sold 3 weeks later to a private buyer who had no interest in sentiment or family legacy. He was a developer, polite but cold, who planned to flip the property and parcel off the lot behind it for construction. I signed the papers without ceremony. When the transfer cleared, Randall called to confirm that Daryl and Clarissa had been served with the final notice. They had 60 days to vacate or buy the remaining shares at a price they could no longer afford. I didn't ask where they went or how they would manage. I no longer wanted to know. It was the last thread between us, and I let it snap without regret. I wasn't being cruel. I was simply done being lied to in my own name. The money from the sale wasn't much after fees and taxes, but it was enough to close the account that Daryl had tried to drain, enough to prepay the place I'd chosen for myself, a small but clean room in a veterans' retirement home in central Ohio, where no one knew me as the man whose son buried him alive. Here I was just Harold. No history to explain, no wounds to keep reopening. The staff were kind without condescension. The food was decent, and I could hear birdsong in the mornings instead of silence so deep it echoed. I donated the rest of the funds anonymously to a local hospice. Not in my name, just in memory of someone who once believed his son would sit at his bedside, not plan his disappearance. Most days I spent reading on a bench beneath a dogwood tree that bloomed late in the spring. The petals would fall in slow spirals, like the past shaking itself loose without need for permission. I played chess with a man named Roy, a former Marine who had outlived both his legs and his bitterness. We didn't talk about family. We didn't have to. Every move on the board said enough. Protect what matters, sacrifice wisely, never leave your king exposed. I hadn't felt that kind of quiet satisfaction in decades. About a month after I moved in, I received a letter. No return address, but I knew the handwriting before I even opened it. Daryl. The envelope was thick. Inside were 3 pages and a photo. The pages were filled with apologies, dense, desperate paragraphs about regret, shame, confusion, and the weight of his decisions. He said he hadn't expected me to forgive him. He just wanted me to know he knew what he had done, that he saw it now for what it was, betrayal, plain and cruel. At the bottom of the 3rd page, he wrote that Clarissa had left him, that he was living in a rented apartment in a bad part of town, that he kept the picture from my old living room. On his desk, the one of me and Eleanor at the lake, just to remember what he'd lost. The photo enclosed was of the 2 of them, taken sometime before her stroke. She was laughing. He was about 8, missing a front tooth, holding her hand like it was the most precious thing in the world. I folded the letter and photo and placed them in a small box beneath my bed. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I had already said everything I needed to say the moment I walked into that funeral. My silence now wasn't absence. It was peace. In the evenings, sometimes, I sit by the window and watch the sun collapse behind the trees in colors too loud for sorrow. I think about Eleanor, about the way she used to hum while washing dishes, about the time she made me laugh so hard I spilled an entire bowl of spaghetti in my lap. I think about Daryl as a child, before mortgages and forged documents, when he used to ask me to read him bedtime stories in my radio voice. And I wonder, not bitterly, but curiously, where it all began to twist. I don't have answers. I don't need them anymore. They say you only die once, but I think that's a lie. I died when they signed those papers. I died when they toasted to my absence with deviled eggs and polite laughter. But I also lived again. In a bus stop, in a courthouse, in a chess match, in a letter that arrived too late to fix anything, but just in time to acknowledge it. And that, I suppose, is what justice feels like. Not triumph, not revenge, just the quiet relief of being seen for who you are, even if it happens at the very end. I am Harold Whitman. I am not gone, and I never will be.